want to be bothered. But then when I worked for the bookstore, the boss said, "Don't make those guys mad. That's the mob."
Right.
And
Exactly.
it was like,
Exactly.
whoa.
Yeah.
You know.
I used to go down there once a week when I worked at Warren Brock's bookstore. We had paperbacks, and I ran the paperback department in the basement. And I would go down and get science fiction, look for new science fiction titles. And if you were in the trade, they were really nice to you.
Yeah.
And I got to know
Well,
them.
one of the interesting things to me was that Chris, again, you have to talk to him. I was in there for years, and he could get stuff for you, even though it wasn't distributed in San Diego.
Yeah.
He could find a
If
way
they
of
knew
getting
you
it.
wanted it.
If he knew you wanted it, you let him know. You talked to him about it. And he was an interesting character. You had a third guy work there who had been a member of the Hitler Youth back in the 30s and 40s. There's another interesting character that worked at Paris News.
I've forgotten his name, but there was an older guy who was like the floor manager down there. And one day I was in there for Warren Brock's, and he said, "Oh, hey, there's a movie sneak preview going on tonight. You want to go to it? Here's a couple tickets. Take a friend." And he gave them to me. Okay. And at the time I didn't have a car, so this girl that I knew, I said, "Oh, this movie. Let's go to the movies." And didn't know really anything about it. We're standing in line. It was Raiders of the Lost Ark. I saw it before its regular release. I just walked in with no idea whatsoever what I was going to see, and was blown away.
What was the bookstore that was on El Cajon Boulevard near College?
Unicorn Bookstore.
Unicorn.
I painted their window.
Okay, that was another place.
They used to
that
be
was
further down next to the 31 Flavors. When you
And then it became the House of Seven Fables. I forget her name at the moment. An occult book dealer of the. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name. She bought it, and the unicorn became the sign of the sun in La Jolla, connected with the movie theater, the Darlings. But Green Tiger Press owned that, and.
Isn't that Mithras Bookstore?
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff would show up at Mithras
Mithras,
Bookstore,
that
which
Mithras,
was part of the
yes,
Unicorn
right.
Theater.
Yeah.
where they always showed like the animation festival.
Right.
Yeah.
And was Richard Alf's Comic Kingdom the first comic store in San Diego? Is there an earlier one than the comic?
No, I think it was the first actual comic book store.
Pacific Comics was before.
Pacific Comics came first.
Was it?
Yeah.
I think it was Golden State Comics in '72 with Greg Ferris. He started then.
No, there's another story there. I won't go into
Yeah,
that.
no, yeah.
So we only have a few more minutes here, and it occurs to me that there might be people in the audience that want to ask a question, so.
Yeah, they want to know where they can find a copy of Fantastic Four #1 for $12.
You can. It's easily done. You just need a time machine.
But I think the takeaway here is that in the 60s in San Diego, there were so many bookstores, newsstands, magazine places that even though the fans didn't know each other, they all ended up going there and getting the stuff and loving the stuff, and it just
We were scroungers. That was the word that I heard the most in those days. I'm going to go out and scrounge some bookstores and see what I can find.
So I think it was just a natural that it, when you had these kind of groups that got together, and then there were catalysts that made it all happen, that there became a convention in San Diego.
Yeah, critical mass and kaboom.
Yeah, it's interesting. There were different groups, and from different perspectives. Like the South San Diego Science Fiction group was more a party crowd, gaming crowd, lowercase science fiction fans, but also into comics and stuff. But you ended up having people showing up at the Harrisons, Harry Harrison's, Suicide Hill, and or Ken Kruger's, or somehow or another you ended up wandering into somebody over here who knew somebody, and all it took was somebody to come along like Shel Dorp to kind of like drop the match into the gasoline.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden,
But Will Lund has.
We've got another old San Diego fan.
Well, I consider myself.
I know, you're already Spokane for.
Later. Yeah, I was in Spokane before when I came down in '68. Regarding Ken Kruger and the Slant Shack, there's a photo of Ken, very young boy at that time, and Harry Warner Jr. took all our
Right.
yesterdays, all our yesteryears. So,
Oh, your yesterdays, yeah.
Yeah, we all had copies of that book.
Yeah, if anybody.
When he hit town, we already had a copy of that.
Yeah, we bought those at the 68 Worldcon.
Yeah.
First band.
Yeah, Scott and Greg Bear and I went to all went together up to the Bay Area for the 1968 Worldcon, the Baycon.
That was a brain fryer in more ways than one.
That's sort of
I saw my first hippies up close. I saw people smoking dope. I saw homosexual hippies going at it.
You smelled tear
I
gas?
smelled tear gas. It was great.
Yeah, what a great trip.
We were watching the 68 Republican convention, or which convention?
Democratic convention.
Democratic
And
convention.
there were sympathy riots.
The riots on TV, I remember, all through the convention. It was like, suddenly, not only did I feel like, God, I'm not alone, there are an awful lot of weirdos here like me, but it was also my first real welcome into the counterculture. And although I didn't, we were kind of a band. We didn't have any weird,
No, we didn't.
initiation rites or anything.
Well, one of the guys at Gary Arlington's store over in San Francisco, and half the people over at the print net had gone to Hoover High School.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I married the daughter of the principal of Hoover High School.
I have one last question.
Any of the gyms, anything that we should be looking for? Maybe someone who's an unsung hero. Any particular titles that any of you might recommend to us?
You mean funny books?
Anything. A science fiction author maybe who's been passed over, or some comic that we should be looking out for.
Okay, you want to start, David?
Well, remember, was it Kate Wilhelm wrote a book called The Clone?
Yeah.
It was a book called The Clone by Kate Wilhelm, and I forget what publisher it came out. It was a 40-cent paperback. Every single one of us in our clique read this book, and
Bill Morrison.
Bill
Warren turned
Bill
this on.
Warren we just went crazy over this book. It's the Blob kind of, and it's the Turd. I mean, it's that whole thing. And I remember all of us were wild about this book, and it's very obscure. But if you can find a copy of that,
That's Valentine.
that's a little gem. Yeah.
I would recommend certain authors like Fred Brown. He wrote What in That Universe, which is a classic piece of all things fan fiction, published as a professional alternate universe affair. And it was his first book. It came out originally as a pulp and startling stories, I think it was, circa 1948. But it's an incredible piece of work. And of course, he was a master of the short story. So any of his short story collections, a lot of which have actually turned up in television and other things now in the form of, Tales from the Dark Side or whatever, because he was such a good writer at turning a twist ending. And some of the people I like are so obscure, I doubt if you'd ever find a copy of Festus Pragnell's Great Man of Greypack.
Well, since we're talking about comics fandom in San Diego, I'm going to say Carl Barks Library.
Yeah,
Is,
Carl Barks.
Fantagraphics is reprinting all of the Carl Barks books in nice hardcovers, and
I bought 2 of them yesterday.
They're down in the dealer's room. Yeah.
you cannot go wrong with a Carl Barks comic.
I will suggest some oddball comics that I absolutely love, and some of them are reprinted. I'm writing a piece for, one of them is Conan, Monarch of Monster Isle, which was like a psychedelic pulp comic book adaptation of Ray Harryhausen movies that never existed. A caveman with a submachine gun discovered at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean in a hidden little prehistoric land winds up joining up with a team of scientists, and the first story is a 10-issue continued story, and it was a quarterly comic book. So that became like one of my main points, is I had to find every time there's a new Kona out. Sam Glanzman wrote them and drew them. They are mind-blowing. And Dover Press is coming out with a reprint set, and I'm writing the introduction.
How about anything by Basil Wolverton?
Well, Basil Wolverton's good.
A little
There's
bit
plenty
odd,
of that
a
stuff
little
out,
different.
but it's not obscure.
That's
Brain
true.
Boy is another one that came out from the same publisher at the same time under the same Editor, L.B. Cole. Jack
Dark Horse reprinted
Yeah.
Great White Comics.
And
hardcover.
Bat wrote the introduction. The third one I'd mention is an old one, and none of these books are expensive, is a thing called Tales Calculated to Drive You Bats. And that was one that was obviously a mad rip-off, but Archie Comics did it. And it was from 1960, so it was all about rock and roll and monsters, but it was like a monster version of Mad Magazine as a kid's comic. And it mightily influenced me. And there are only 6 of them, and the first 3 are the best. But George Glatter, who lived here in San Diego, many of you probably know him, he wrote them, and he worked with a cartoonist named Orlando Bucino, who's one of my biggest influences. But they are, for their day at least, they were great, and they're wonderful little relics of what boys like me wanted to read about in 1960.
Yeah, more mainstream, but an obscure title, Captain Carrot and the Zoo Crew, you might be the...
By-
Roy Thomas's got
By a guy that really didn't know what he was doing. Yeah, that's the
One
biggest
last, Mike, recommendation.
If you're interested in seeing what the early days of comic fandom were like, go on eBay, look for Rocket's Blast Comic Collector. It was really central to comic fandom in those days, and it was where fans and small dealers would buy and sell comics, and there would be articles and covers, and it was put out by a man named G.B. Love, who was down in Texas, and he had was a muscular dystrophy, and he would just peck it out in his typewriter with, I think, a pencil just kind of clutched in his fist, because that's all he could do, and he was a remarkable individual, and that was really central to comic fandom in those days, in our pre-internet days and whatnot. That was where we got our news
And where you could advertise your comics.
Where you could advertise your comics and your fanzines. I advertised my fanzine in Rocket's Blast. And the other thing is Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby is so central to San Diego, what developed as Comic-Con. And at the very end of the 60s, in 1969, he moved to Irvine, and that was one of the most important things for the development of Comic-Con, because he supported us from the very beginning. In November of '69, we took a little field trip up to visit Jack, and his wife Roz made hamburgers for us, and it was great. And he advised us on what sort of convention we would have. And in fact, we asked him, should the convention just be about comics, or should we include other things like science fiction and films? And he just said, well, boys, I think if you include these other things that comic fans love, like science fiction and films, you'll have a better experience, a richer experience. And so,
because Jack was a fan himself. In fact, he kept, even in the studio, he had like these cheap metal racks of dozens of moldering pulps, because that's what he looked at for inspiration. Not to rip off stuff, but that took him back to when he was a teenager.
Well, he started in 1938, wasn't it? Yeah, 1938. He invented Captain America in 1940.
He told me that he
We're
found
actually
a
running
pulp
over our
magazine
time
floating
here,
down
and
the
Mike's got
gutter.
another thing that he's got to be on.
Wow.
Thank you, everybody.